Is it really? Oh my gosh. That's cool. All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Have touch, please. All quiet, please. Thank you. Mia's ready. Mia's ready. So we're going to get into the pledge. Have your notes out. We're going to be diving into World War I and getting you guys all caught up on, boom, all of the weapons of the war. But let's go ahead and do the pledge first. Okay, stand for the pledge. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. All right, let me just double check where we were. We still haven't started the war? No, we did get the backhand. We did get the assassination. Okay. Oh, that's right, because I clarified that, because people are like, what about the emperor? Anyway, so I think we clarified that. That's good. Okay, so have we begun World War I yet? Yes, and later I will show you some great stuff. It's someone was very clever, and it's actually become a meme, and a lot of students have done video projects on this. If World War I was a bar fight, basically it's kind of like you're looking at this, and you're looking at this, and there's all this aggression, and then the fight breaks out, and the first one to get hit is neutral Belgium that's just standing around doing nothing, right? Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's like we'll have, and hopefully we'll have time to share with you guys some of that. For some reason, this always happens. Even if I just have 2 classes, certainly if I have 4 classes, one gets a little bit ahead of the others and so forth, for a variety of reasons, questioning this, that, and so forth. And but anyway, we're going to get right into the beginning of World War I. So in your notes, have the beginning of World War I. So you probably want to tuck that away. Okay? And then we're going to get into the technological developments, and then get into the strategies and tactics as well. Okay? So nature of war, big thing. I think probably the next essay that I'm going to have you guys do is going to be talking about some of the technological developments as far as like the nature of war. Okay? World War I, World War II are very good for that, because does technology impact how the war plays out? Absolutely. And it's like, whoa, this one ended up being a lot different than expected. And you found out right away. All right? Just to back up, let's see. What was the immediate cause, Cole, of World War I? The immediate cause, the thing, the spark. The guy assassinated Serbia something. So when you're writing an essay and you want to have relevant, accurate details, assassination sounds good, Serbia sounds good, a guy. The royal dude. If this was like tag team wrestling and so forth, you'd be like, help me. All right, Jeremiah, help him out. Yeah. Shh. She was in the range. She was in the car. Okay. All right. And so Austria was mad. Actually, make sure you have this in your notes. A lot of countries were mad. I mean, a lot of countries were mad. This was sort of like, and I use the analogy of like right after 9/11, when the United States got hit by terrorists, extremists, and so forth, a lot of the world was very, very sympathetic. There were not too many people out there in the world going, yay, wow, America deserved it, having civilians killed in office buildings and so forth. And so, people were rallying around. Here's another analogy. Within a very short period of time, the United States is looking around going, okay, who is responsible for that? Okay? Who is responsible for that? Al-Qaeda, it turns out. Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, right? He got these guys to train up and participate in suicide missions, but he was hanging out with his other fellow Al-Qaeda types in Afghanistan. And so we turned our attention to Afghanistan, and basically, yeah, well, I mean, we eventually got Osama bin Laden. He was evasive for quite some time. But as far as the Taliban government in charge of Afghanistan, key analogy, that had allowed for the training of the Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We're like, we're going to get you. that is not going to continue happening. No way. And so we go in there, and we have a lot of countries supporting us, okay? We got a lot of countries supporting us. The difference here, in the month after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, Austria puts a lot of pressure on Serbia, basically saying, man, you got to stop allowing for the Black Hand to operate. You got to shut it with this whole idea of, oh, you need to take over, the Bosnian region because there's a bunch of Slavic people, including Serbs, in that region. You got to stop it. So Austria gave an ultimatum. They were like, you need to fix this. And Serbia ultimately was like, okay, we can go along with this, but we're not just going to hand over our entire country. So they didn't quite meet. A month later, they didn't quite meet. So July 28th, I think it was. July 28th was when Austria declared war. Now, Serbia knew they were in trouble, but they also knew that Russia was going to back them up. Russia's sympathies for having a member of the royal family, Austrian royal family, being killed, eventually turned away, and what came in was, hey, we see our Serbian little brothers here getting bullied. Got that? So a lot of things happened in that month. It was almost like if Austria had turned around like within days and attacked Serbia, we might not have had World War I, maybe, right? Because Russia would have stayed out. And if Russia stayed out, then it's just a conflict right between those two countries. But because Russia stays in, basically supporting its smaller ally, that means the whole alliance system kicks into place, and it becomes a bigger war. Because if Russia and Austria are on the opposite sides of war, where is Germany? With Austria. It's interesting because if you look around the world today, are there any military alliances, say that the United States has, that says, if your country is attacked, we're there for you? NATO. Right? We have a lot of actually now, all over Europe, a lot of countries, including Estonia, woohoo, that if one of them gets attacked, the other one will. And in fact, after 9/11, NATO thing kicked in, and we weren't there alone going into Afghanistan. We had NATO allies. Okay? Although it's interesting because what if two NATO allies attack each other? There's a clause that basically says we can stay out if we want. Okay? Yeah, it does. But if one NATO ally gets hit, Section 5, all of the other NATO allies come in there. That kind of clause existed with respect to Austria and Germany. Germany is going to be into the fight. Okay? All right? So the Austrian-German alliance is there. Later, we know the Ottoman Turks will join that alliance, and together they'll be called the Central Powers. Okay? Evan, what alliance was Russia in that they could count on countries to back them up if they were at war? There's 3 big countries, and it's called the Triple Entente. Russia can count on which other 2 countries? And they're big industrial countries. No. No. One of them speaks the same language I'm talking to you right now in. The other one is from a country that I'm using the accent from, but it's not. That does sound like French, sort of. Thank you very much. So France and Britain immediately come in. So here's the deal. You ready? Now let's get to the war. The Germans were anticipating this. They had come up with a plan prior to, this is actually written down in 1905 by a German general with the last name Schlieffen. And his idea is, anticipating that if there ever was a war again with France, and by that time they knew that Britain and France were together, and by that time they knew that the Austrian conflict and so forth had brought Russia into an alliance with Britain and France, the Germans knew they were going to have a challenge. They were going to have to potentially likely fight a war on 2 fronts, which is exactly what happened. So here was the German plan. You ready? Write this down. The Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan anticipates the biggest challenge for Germany is going to come from Britain and France. Britain's going to move its troops right across the English Channel to shore up the French front lines. The Russians, because they're not as industrialized, they're not as modern, they're going to take a longer time to mobilize. Write that down. Russia will take a longer time to mobilize and get its troops ready to go into combat. Okay? Germany knows that. Britain and France, They've got more modern transportation infrastructure. They're going to be able to move their troops into a battle position very quickly. So Germany decides it wants to take out Britain and France, boom, first, and then move around and pivot and move its forces then to take out Russia. That's the plan. Okay? Will it work? No. The irony is it's not going to be successful against Britain and France. And so they will have to have armies fighting against Britain and France on the Western Front as well as Russia on the Eastern Front. Which will they succeed? Eastern or Western? Which will the Germans succeed? Which will they win on ultimately? Eastern. The Eastern Front. Because Russia can do a good fight, but ultimately they're going to be hamstrung by their lack of industrial technology and so forth and mobilization. There's going to be some other things that will factor into that. Whoops. So here's the, here's the beauty of the Schlieffen Plan. It actually is sneaky. Whereas in the Franco-Prussian War, whoops, there we go. I hate it when I drop this and it like gets jammed and then the little thing doesn't work as well. Come on. Oh no, the little thing came out. Come on. Oh my gosh. Oh yeah, the little right button. It happens sometimes. Okay. Technology. Isn't it just so lovely? You know, you get a little thing here. Good grief. Get the little button jammed. I need that because I need to mobile. I can only go in one direction. Oh, I can sort of go, but it's not working very well. I'll try. Okay. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. See, it's like Nemo. It's the Nemo little thing. Okay, you got a little weak fin there, but you can still do it, buddy. All right, here we go. So, when Germany, before it was Germany, it was Prussia, right? When they attacked France, they went directly at the French lines, okay? And they won a quick war. I mean, it could have gone either way, but they won a quick war. Ding, 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 ding. Ding. All right. Oh, my gosh, this is ridiculous. There is maybe a little tack or something. Just needs to kind of jar that loose a little bit. Come on. Oh, you did it. Now, just don't drop it. All right, so the Schlieffen Plan actually looks, write this down. The French, anticipating that someday they were going to be at war with Germany, had built along their frontier, along their border, a lot of really good defensive fortifications. Okay? Makes sense. Build a wall. Like not just a wall to prevent people from going this way and that way, but build a military fortification along with the German border. Because they knew that they had Belgium and Luxembourg up to their north. Those are cool. Those are neutral. I mean, who would dare violate the Belgian and Luxembourg neutrality? Well, in this instance, Germany would. Because Germany wants to hit France where it is less well fortified. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the part of the Schlieffen Plan is to attack Belgium. You already know that. We've already kind of seen that in the videos. They attack Belgium, they come through, and then they enter into northern France. The goal is to go all the way into Paris and get the French to surrender and so forth. It doesn't work out that way. As we will see, write this down. This is the key theme for nature of war. We've already intimated this. Because of industrial technological advances, which type of weapons in war were at a position for advantage at that time in history? Offensive weapons or defensive weapons? Defensive weapons. And so the French and the British will be able to regroup and ultimately be able to stop the Germans to build trenches, and in those trenches they will put in some very effective defensive weapons. Machine guns, sniper rifles, and barbed wire. We'll go into those specifically. And so even though there's some pretty good offensive weapons, it doesn't have the advantage in World War I at that stage. Okay? And of course then, once the French and the British are able to hold their lines, they're thinking, okay, we're going to counterattack. Well, guess what? The other side can use those same defensive weapons as well. you'll get stalemate. You'll have trenches on both sides. And when I mean trenches, I mean row upon row upon row upon trenches. If you lose your first line of trench, you still have your second line. For an offense on the Western Front, it's very hard. If you can get through no man's land and take the other guy's first line of defense, their trench, then what do? Then you try to go and take the second line. In the meantime, of course, sometimes they would kind of like fake you out. Like the Germans, I remember there was one time they were sort of like retreating from their lines, and the British and the French were like, oh, cool, let's just go in there. And then actually the Germans kind of used it to sort of encircle and attack from both sides. But no one's going to gain a clear advantage on the Western Front until near the end of the war. And mostly it's not because you're taking over land, it's because the Germans are like, we're starving to death here, and we see the arrival of all of these American troops. We see that this is not going to work out very well. Okay? Let's get into some of the big technological advances here. Okay? Artillery, write this down. Artillery is going to see some major advances. And artillery is going to be used mostly for, write it down, the offense. The offense. If you go back and look at wars like the Civil War, you get these battles where you've got guys with cannons, 3 or 4 guys on a cannon unit, and they're firing off at the other cannons, and they're firing off. Sometimes they fill the cannons with like shot, and so they'll fire it off at the infantry as they're coming in. So cannons are pretty important. And they're going to be involved like in the mix of the battle and just throughout the whole thing. You'll have cannons and artillery, and infantry. It's all taking place at the same time. In World War I, write this down, mostly when you see the artillery, it's going to precede the big battles. Okay? Mostly you're going to have the artillery being used to soften up the defenses. And I want to mean soften up. I mean, you got big guns here. This is Big Bertha. The German gun had a name. I think the English gave it that name. I don't know if the Germans called it that. But you get similar sized type guns that have been developed in Britain and France and Germany, less so in, say, some of the less industrialized countries like Austria and Russia. And you can do that because you have improved manufacturing capability. Can any of you guys like make a cannon in your kiln and so forth, or whatever in your backyard? Your little smelter. You need high heat. And you need, if you're going to get all the metals to come together in like a really powerful steel thing so that you can have an explosion propelling a shell a long distance, a big shell, you understand this? If you're going to build that, you need to have really highly refined steel-making capability. You understand that? Germany, Britain, France, and the United States will be able to do that. And when you can build an artillery piece like that, a big cannon, man, you can fire bigger shells that have more explosive capability. Do you understand that? And you can fire them at greater distances. So when these pieces are being fired off, they will launch and hit targets that you can't even see where they're blowing up. Miles away. You got it? It is crazy. Oh my gosh, the shells are huge. They're massive. And of course, this is the whole scale of it. And we'll see, it's like, that's why you need so many people, particularly women, in the factories making shell after shell after shell after shell to keep sending to the front line so they can keep boom, boom, boom. The irony is, mostly this made a mess of your opponent's defenses, but not enough to overwhelm them. So write this down. This is how it would work. The generals would go, we're planning an attack. We're going to attack on the Western Front. We're going to plow through their front lines. So we're going to hit them. Boom, boom, boom. An hour or two, is that enough? No. Sometimes you'll have, especially later in the war, days of artillery hitting. Boom, 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 boom. The idea is to weaken up the defenses so that you can call your infantry to go and just, take it over. All right? So let's see how this works. You want to be on the attack or the defense? Attack. You're on the attack. What do you want to be? Do you want to be the Central Powers or do you want to be the Allies? You're Germany. Okay, so you're Germany, and you're, I don't know, because sometimes the British and the French, sometimes they would coordinate their attack together. Sometimes it's like, well, it's the British turn to do a big major attack. And other times it's the French. What do you guys want to be, the French or the British? Okay, what? We, just the French. So here we go. Typical, battle. So the French, pound, 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 pound. You're the Germans, and you're like, it seems like the French are getting ready for an attack, because here come their artillery shells. Notice this. You don't fire your artillery shells while you're on the attack. Why? You'll hit your own guys, and that's not good. Friendly fire is not so friendly. When you get hit by a bullet, whatever direction it comes from, it's not good. Okay? So, Germans, you're anticipating this attack. In the meantime, what are you doing? Oh, love that. You're chill on the ground sounds kind of deadly, actually. You're like you're like temperature of the air. No, you do. Write this down. You go into the ground. I mean, you're already in a trench, but is there any place safer than a trench? Yeah, they've got dugout bunkers. Write it down. Dugout bunkers. That's where they head. Now, it sucks if your bunker takes a direct hit, because then all of a sudden you got earth on top of you, and yeah, you are chilling in the ground. I mean, you're stuck in the ground. You're dead. But it's better than being like near the top, because, you know, those shells are hitting and blowing things up. Yes, the shells are breaking up some of the barbed wire defenses, but the people are there, and they're waiting until the shelling stops. When the shelling stops, they know to do what? No. Go out of the bunkers and go up to your machine gun post. Oh, my gosh, here we go. Right? Okay? So you've got the barbed wire, okay, which is really bad for people who are trying to attack. Now, if you're trying to attack them, we'll get to that later. If you're trying to attack them, you could get stuck in your own barbed wire, which really sucks. It's kind of like, who put that barbed wire? I don't know. Who was the last one to build the trenches in this area? So you got barbed wire, which is really bad, because if you get stuck in the barbed wire, you're like, I can't move. Oh, no. Somebody on the other side is eyeing you for a target. So here are the defensive weapons. Write it down. We've alluded to this before. Write it down. We got machine gun posts. And machine gun posts are really, really effective for defense. You can't pick them up and run on offense with these machine guns, okay? But they're very, very heavy, and they're very effective for defense. And you put them maybe 100 yards away from each other, closer if you got enough. And you basically, it's really simple, you know? You just point, exactly. You just spray. You don't need to be accurate. You just need, and you got somebody down that way, and they're spraying as well. So you guys are like, in the early stages of the war, you didn't realize, you're like, you got your young officers, your young lieutenants, and they're like, let's go, boys. You're going to be probably the first one shot and killed. A lot of young officers killed in the early stages of the war, because they're the first ones out there in what we'll call no man's land. And they're getting pegged by either the machine gun spray or the sniper rifles, who are like posted all the way in between the machine gun nests. So you guys go over, and mostly you die in no man's land. And you guys are thinking, hey, it is good to be on the defense. And then your commander says, ha-ha, we've gained the advantage. Prepare for the counterattack. Eventually in the war, you're going, please, no, no, no. Because then you jump out of your trenches, over the top, they would say, over the top, and you run into no man's land, and these guys are retreating and are like, okay, we can do defense a lot better. You run back to your machine gun post, you grab, and you've got your rifles, and you start shooting them down in no man's land. Do you see? This is messed up. Yeah, this is messed up, okay? Any questions about how this is? Eventually, write this down, eventually you'll get, like, you guys are the French. As you get later in the war, your commanders are going, okay, we're preparing for an attack. And you're like, no. I mean, they literally, it's kind of like a semi-mutiny. You don't actually completely quit. You're like, company commander, general, excuse me, could you like not order us into a suicide attack mission? We'll defend France. We'll be on the defense. We'll stay on our post for that reason. But we're not going to go on the attack, because that is suicide. You're Belgium. Yeah, you're Belgium. So therefore, you're on their side, yeah, because you got overrun by the Germans in the initial stages of the war, okay? Eventually, the Germans will be the first. Oh, shame on you, Germans, using mustard gas. But the British and the French will jump in, too. So you'll have both sides eventually using gas. It works this way, okay? It's really nasty. Here's a person without it. Here's the same person after mustard gas. He's alive, so it didn't kill him, but it does just make a mess of soft tissue. On the outside, yeah. It's like, yeah. And if it gets inside of you, it can just like tear apart your like breathing ability, blinding. It's not very good for the eyes. Eventually, I mean, the first time it's used, the defenders, I think it was the French, they're like dying. I mean, they're dying. Eventually, what are you going to use? What are you going to use to protect yourself against a mustard gas attack? Yeah, some gas mask. So you're like, when you think that there's like a mustard gas attack or so forth, you get the gas mask on. Your little things will not do. That ain't going to do nothing. You got this, it's like a Darth Vader kind of thing and so forth. So it's, somewhat effective at preventing that. Oh, yeah. But you got to get that thing on because otherwise you don't stand a chance. Because basically how it works is the mustard gas, you can write this down, it is attached to an artillery shell. So it's fired into an area. You're like, well, that wasn't that explosive. And you're like, oh, no, look what's coming out of the shell. The mustard gas, it's a chemical weapon. It's heavier than air. So it stays low to the ground. It seeps into like the craters and into the trenches, and you can even sink down into the bunkers. Close the door. I'm trying to get some, that's not fresh air. Yeah. It's really, really bad. Eventually, you can write this down. After World War II, lots of countries will come together and go, we're never going to use that ever again. So a lot of countries, they don't use that much chemical weapons in World War II. Yay! But, I mean, there'll still be uses of it in history. But there's a lot of condemnation from countries if you use chemical weapons. Kill people the old-fashioned way. Blow them up, limb from limb. Don't tear apart their internal organs with gas and so forth. That's just not sporting. It's very difficult. Although, here's a weird story because it's like, would I be here but for this and that? I've got two stories. You ready? Here we go. Mustard gas and atomic weapons. If not for those, I might not be here. You're like, what are you talking about? My mom, English. Her dad fought in World War I. He got mustard gassed. He survived. It affected his respiratory ability. I don't know for a fact, but I can hypothesize that perhaps after World War I, when there's a lot of guys that are dead and a lot of women who are looking for husbands and so forth, actually you can write that down. There were a lot of women in Britain and Germany and France and so forth who were of marrying age, but there weren't as many men around. That generation had been not entirely wiped out, but it's very severely decimated. So my mom would always talk about anti-this and anti-this and anti-this, all these women in her family that weren't married. There's not as many men to go around among them. But my grandfather did marry my granny, my mother's mother, and she was a lovely lady, but I think the fact also that she was a nurse was to her credit, because I think my grandfather could definitely use the assistance of an in-house wife nurse person over the years. So, but for mustard gas, perhaps he would have never married the woman who he did marry. My mother wouldn't have existed the way she did, and I wouldn't have existed. So, bad thing, mustard gas. Ooh, but an interesting consequence, my mother. Oh, my dad, he was already created by World War II. He went into the United States Navy, coming straight out of high school. We'll talk about this more later on. He was assigned to the USS Saratoga, a aircraft carrier that was severely decimated by Japanese kamikaze attacks near the end of World War II. It went back stateside for repairs and new crew, and he was assigned to it. And he was on the ship, headed to Japan for the final assault, the amphibious landing on the mainlands of Japan, which was going to be high casualties for the Japanese as well as the United States servicemen, and particular ships like the Saratoga, which would have been, once again, targeted as a primary target. So what put that? He actually never had it in combat. By the time they got there, the war was over. Why? What ended World War II? Boom, boom. Atomic weaponry. But for atomic weaponry, maybe my dad would not have survived World War II. So therefore, he would have never met my mom, and I would not exist to talk to you. What's that? No, I mean, Japan surrendered after the 2 atomic weapons. Yeah, we'll get to that when we get to World War II. They surrendered, and I mean, the beauty is, at the end of World War II, the United States and Japan became very good friends during the Cold War. The United States and the western part of Germany that we liberated became very good friends during the Cold War. So, mustard gas, bad. Atomic weapons, bad. But Mr. Hansen, there we go, there we go. So sometimes from bad things, interesting things can happen. Yeah. It's like if you traced all the stories from your family and so forth, you're like, well, if they hadn't been, they would have never met unless they'd been in the same concentration camp. Oh my gosh. What the heck? Yeah, you know. Is there any good thing that can come from a major forest fire? Little sprouts of new growth. Anyway. So, mustard gas. Tanks. Let's write this down. Tanks. Yeah! That's an early tank. That's an early tank. Okay? Anybody want to raise your hand and tell me an advantage of going on offense with a tank-like piece of equipment? What do you mean you could not die? Why? Because, write this down, early tanks had the advantage, as in later tanks, of having heavy armor. So if instead of like being an infantry guy that's got your clothes to protect you, if you're in a tank, you're able to go across no man's land with a better opportunity of not being shot by a bullet. Okay? You got that? Yeah.
I know they built the tanks so long and then the tracks super long so they can roll over trenches.
Exactly. Roll over trenches and roll over no man's land and so forth. And they're not bad. They did get stuck a bit. This is early technology. Write this down. They'll start making a little bit of a difference as they're introduced later in the war from both sides. But they're not going to make as big of a difference compared to when we get to World War II. When we get to World War II, we're going to see advancements in tank technology. They're going to make it so that, man, you got a whole division of tanks, and they're plowing down the enemy. Oh, my gosh. They can be very effective on offense. Not quite yet enough. Do you got that? Not quite yet enough. It's an early sign that technology is going to start weighing in to help the offense. And they will in a big way. When we get to Germany and Blitzkrieg in World War II, tanks, boom, 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 boom. And airplanes, boom, boom, boom. Defenses will be decimated if they're properly hit by a combination of attack by tank and infantry and attack by aircraft.
Why do most of those planes have big targets on them?
So you know which it is. This is the British. There's the German. I think that's Italian, actually. The French. There was the French. Write this down. Early aircraft. I mean, aircraft had not been invented like maybe, 10 years, within 10 years of World War I coming around. You're not going to see, like eventually you'll see, here's a painting Picasso did of Guernica in northern Spain that was under the assault of German aircraft as part of the Spanish Civil War in the late 30s. In the late teens in World War I, you didn't have aircraft technology that was sufficient to carry up in the air a lot of heavy weapons. Write that down. They couldn't carry lots of bombs. No. So you couldn't really fly over and do major bombing attacks. Bombing attacks from the air are going to come more in World War II. We'll get a little bit more of a sense of that when that's used in the Spanish Civil War. Oh yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy. I mean, initially you'll have guys, holding handguns and shooting at each other. Put this down. The major advantage from the early use of aircraft is reconnaissance. It's observation. It's spying on what the other side is doing. So let's say you've got some aircraft, right? Let's say you're the Germans and you're like, I wonder what the French lines, I wonder what the British, I wonder if they're getting ready for an attack or something. So you send this really kind of light, flimsy craft over, and they're flying over, and they're getting a good look at what's going on. And you're looking up going, dang, they're getting a good look at us. And you're like, poop, not a very effective anti-aircraft equipment. Your sniper rifle and so forth. What's a better way to counter an aerial observation? Send up your own. Write it down. You send up your own. You send up your own. And you're like, get out of my yard. And you've got these British aircraft and French aircraft, and they're up there with the German aircraft, and everyone on the ground's like, whoa, this is cool. They're in a dogfight. They're in a dogfight. And the German's like, I can take you out because I'm an ace. And he's like, they eventually will attack, attach machine guns to their thing. But you have to be careful because if you don't get it lined up enough, oh, I just blew up my propeller. You have to synchronize it so the bullets go through the if you've got it set it up that way. You understand? Eventually, it's going to be pretty cool. You'll have these dogfights going up, and you'll hear about the heroes on one side or the other and so forth. But just know this, it's cool, perhaps, like in a technological way. Is it going to determine the outcome of major battles? Not so much. Yeah, I mean, yeah. There's going to be a need for improvement. Will there be improvement in aircraft by the time we get to World War II? Boy, howdy, there will. It's going to make a big, big difference. This is something the Germans actually developed. Lighter than air, like balloons. They call them dirigibles. The Germans call them zeppelins. If you're coming up with a band in the late 60s and early 70s, and you're like, I don't know, that really like is about as effective as a dirigible made out of heavy metal. A Led Zeppelin, there you go. Ba-dum-bum. But here's the deal. And you can see, I love this picture because it's like the Germans would send it over, and you could carry a lot of bombs. It could carry a fair amount of weight. They would fly it over. Austin, if you're the Germans, what city are you going to try and fly that over?
London.
Paris or London? Yeah, this one in particular, I think London got hit a few times. But, I mean, how do you defend against a dirigible attack, a Zeppelin attack? You send your airplanes up there, and it's like, ooh, you're really maneuverable there, balloon. No, you're not. Boom, boom, boom. And a lot of times, these balloons were filled with highly flammable hydrogen gas. So you hit a spark. Poof. So the idea is there, you're never going to see dirigibles really used effectively in war for the offense. Okay? Yeah, I mean, heliums are better. Helium is a better thing to use if you're going to be doing, like, blimps. Shell shock, write this down. Now, this is like the part where it's like, wow, war really does suck. And war has always sucked, but this is something that is going to be even more pronounced during this time period. Let's talk about this. If you're on the defense and you're going through 40, 50, 60 hours of continuous shelling, it may not blow you up, but it may impact your psyche. You may walk out of your trench looking physically okay, but your brain, something has happened to it. And you can't walk sometimes. You can't talk sometimes. And your commander's looking at you like, you can't fire a weapon. This person is disabled by the effects of war. They called it during World War I shell shock. And they started noticing it even more than had existed in previous wars. And more doctors will look and go, this is a serious thing. We have to do something to treat it. And they didn't know quite what it was. The first thing is you have to recognize that it actually is a serious thing. Today we call it post-traumatic shock disorder. Okay? Post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah, there we go. Stress disorder, sorry. It is a real thing. I mean, you can have that if you're like in a military combat. You can have it if you see a traffic accident. You can have it if you like have a continuous like really bad situation in what would otherwise appear a normal family school life. Hopefully you don't walk out of North Star with PTSD. But anyway, it's a real thing. You're like, you walked in with PTSD. And it's like, so what do? You'll see there's going to be various different treatments. First of all, you take them away from the front. Okay? You take them away from the front. What kinds of things can they do? Well, take them away from the front. How about electric shock? Write that down. Some of them are like, maybe a little bit of electricity going through somebody's body can work. And if it works for some people, let's try it on all of them. It doesn't necessarily always work. Sometimes, yeah. And in fact, you're going to see some images and you're like, oh my gosh, leave that poor man alone. He's trying to walk, and they're like shocking him from the back. What the heck? And another thing is, eventually they're going to start going, okay, Freud has some ideas. Psychotherapy, write that down. Psychotherapy is actually going to help. Call it the talking cure. Let them talk about their experiences and so forth and kind of like help ease into it so that maybe a little bit more normality can come so they're not having like freak out nightmares all the time. They don't freak out at the sight of a French officer's cap or the word bomb or just like some loud noise. Because this is a problem. And in fact, it's tough because you come home to your loving family and friends and they're like, what has happened to you? Who's the only people that can actually have some appreciation of what you've gone through? People who have been there too, your fellow soldiers and stuff. And it's a real problem in the world today. You come back, you get people who have been in PTSD in war types of situations. It can debilitate their ability to hold a job, have a normal life. and have the drinking cure, which is not really much of a cure, and you get higher rates of suicide among people who have untreated, ineffectively treated PTSD. Yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah. Oh yeah. Not just war, yeah. But they start recognizing here. When we get to World War II, there's like a great American commander, Patton, and he's not a big fan of the whole shit. If he sees some guy sitting around, he's like, "You're a coward." He actually went into a military hospital one time, saw these guys all wounded and so forth, and saw this one guy sitting there perfectly normal, at least as far as physical, but he was shaking. And he's like, "You're a coward. You get out of here. We got real men who've been fighting and so forth." And he slapped the guy with his gloves. That did not go over well. To give you a sign that like, Patton was old school. He was a great commander and so forth. He was old school. There was a lot of pressure on President Roosevelt to fire him. And Roosevelt's like, "Man, this guy's good. I don't want to lose him as a top commander." So he apologized to the soldier, to the doctors, to the entire division, and he kept his job. But that was a sign that things were starting to turn. It's serious, and people take it much more seriously now. It was starting in World War I that they started to really pay serious attention to it. You want to see? Yeah. I'll give you some images. Not a fun place to be hanging out.
1917. My own dear mother. Since I set foot on Calais Quays, I have not had dry feet. We were let down gently into the real thing, mud. It has penetrated now, sanctuary, my sleeping bag, and that holy of holies, my pajamas. I chose a servant for myself yesterday, not for his profile, nor yet his clean hands, but for his excellence in bayonet work. I censored hundreds of letters yesterday, and the hope of peace was in every one.
Wilfred Owen was a young poet just finding his voice when war broke out. He marched off to battle with a romantic view of war common among the young.
Oh, meet it is, and passing sweet, to live in peace with others, but sweeter still and far more meet to die in war for brothers.
That was his early poetry.
The officer class fitted for war as innocents. It was a frightful shock to discover that the sort of their imagination of war, which had been fed by the classical literature of war, was incorrect. The war wasn't brave and heroic. It was pretty horrible and nasty and dirty, and you were more concerned about keeping dry and keeping warm than you were about closing with the enemy.
Owen was commissioned a second lieutenant and sent to join the 2nd Manchester Regiment on the Somme. He entered the trenches in the middle of the worst winter in memory.
My own dear mother. I can see no excuse for deceiving you about these last 4 days. I have not been at the front. I have been in front of it. I held an advanced post in the middle of no man's land. The Germans knew we were staying there and decided we shouldn't. Those 50 hours were the agony of my happy life. I nearly broke down and let myself drown in the water that was slowly rising over my head. I suppose I can endure cold and fatigue and the face-to-face death as well as a mother. But extra for me there is the universal pervasion of ugliness. The distortion of the dead, whose unburiable bodies sit outside the dugouts. In poetry we call them glorious, but to sit with them all day, all night, and a week later to come back and find them still sitting there in motionless groups, that is what saps.
They didn't stop the battles to clear the dead. The rats consumed dead bodies.
Had to cope with images that didn't go away. Many of these parts of human bodies were actually used to shore up the trench system itself. Some soldiers found it humorous to hang their water canteens on a protruding arm or a protruding leg. These were not people who were disrespectful of the dead. They were living with the dead. One can imagine the possibilities.
I'll keep it plain. You can wipe down, though.
Known to such images. But those who couldn't turn off their feelings, internalize them, brought them home with them, lived with them, dreamt about them, and went mad because of them.
While Wilfred Owen was sleeping, a shell hit his blasting him into the air and killing a fellow officer. Owen spent days trapped near the dismembered body. When finally relieved, he was found to be confused, trembling, and behaving strangely.
My very dear sister, you must not entertain the least concern about me. You know, it was not the Germans that worked me up, nor the explosives, but it was living so long by poor old Cock Robin, as we used to call Second Lieutenant Kroger, who lay not only nearby, but in various places around and about,
Wow.
if you understand.
Owen was diagnosed as having shell shock and sent home. He had lasted only 4 months.
Yeah. I'll play the shell shock part for you about the treatment and so forth next time.
That's why I have utmost respect for any military officer that's willing to go on the field or even join the military.
You think? Yeah. It's not an easy thing to do. Yeah. And it's not always so easy to